Nina felt the weight of 200 stares before she even heard the first words. The silence of a court that had never wanted her there, weak and bedridden now, in the center of the very kingdom she'd sworn to defend beside the man she loved. She had never bowed her head. Not when they said a woman had no place beside an alpha king in council. Not when his mother looked at her the way one looks at a mistake waiting to be corrected. Not when a seer, years ago, had declared in front of everyone that she would never give the throne an heir. The fever had come without warning. The delirium, the dizziness, the body rejecting food. The healers examined all of it, and none of them found an answer. But the same seer who had once declared her barren now had a new sentence ready. Plague. A sickness too dangerous to remain within the castle walls. Too dangerous to allow her to go on being Luna. The Luna is sick. They say it's contagious. Poor thing, so young, and already with one foot in the grave. She heard those words and understood in that moment that a lifetime of strength, of battles won against an entire society's contempt, was crumbling under a single sentence whispered by a seer in service to someone who had always wanted her far from the throne. Alpha King Niklaus, her king, who had sworn never to bow his head to anyone, was forced to make the cruelest choice of his life, to leave her alone, feverish and humiliated, within the cold walls of a forgotten castle where no one had set foot in generations. Months passed. No letters, no trace. Only the promise, sealed in a desperate kiss at the gate of that empty castle, that he would return. And when he finally did return, exhausted, wounded, hunted by the very throne he'd sworn to protect, the Alpha King did not find the weak, sickly woman he'd left behind. He found her pregnant with quintuplets. And the pain he felt, standing there before her, was greater, far greater, than anything he had ever felt in his entire life as king. What he didn't know was that the hardest days of his life were only just beginning. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The throne room smelled of melted wax and wilting flowers, the same ones nobody had bothered to replace since the last full moon. Nina smelled it before she noticed the silence, and she noticed the silence before she realized every set of eyes in the court was fixed on her. She knelt in the center of the room, not because she wanted to, but because her legs simply couldn't hold her anymore. Cold sweat trickled down the back of her neck, plastering her dark hair to her skin, and the gown, the very same embroidered gown that had made her feel like a queen the night before, now weighed on her like rusted armor. Every breath hurt, every stare hurt worse. "The Luna is weak," stepmother Isolde's voice cut through the air like a verdict, and maybe it was one. "Too weak to rule beside my son." Nina lifted her chin, sick, dizzy, exhausted, but not beaten, never beaten. "I'm only tired, Your Highness," she answered, and her own voice sounded strange to her ears, hoarse, distant, as if it belonged to some other woman. Tired isn't the same as weak. A murmur rippled through the hall. She knew that sound well. The collective whisper of a court that had never wanted her there, that had never accepted a Luna who raised her voice in council, who disagreed with the elders, who hunted alongside the warriors instead of embroidering in the shadow of the windows. Nina had spent years swallowing that contempt like poison in small doses, until her body learned to withstand it. But today, the poison felt stronger than she was. The nausea returned, sudden, rising in her throat like a wave. She clenched her jaw, pressed her fists into the fabric of her dress, tried, in vain, to keep her face steady in front of 200 pairs of eyes that only waited to watch her fall. That was when she felt his hand. Niklaus had crossed the room in long strides, breaking protocol, breaking ceremony, breaking every pretense of royal distance the court demanded between an Alpha King and his Luna in public. He dropped to his knees beside her, and the gesture, so simple, so human, was more scandalous than any shout could have been. Nina. Just that. Just her name, spoken low, as if it were the only word that mattered in the whole world. "I'm fine," she lied, and he knew it was a lie, because he knew her too well to be fooled. "You're freezing and burning up at the same time," Niklas murmured, his large hand wrapping around hers, his fingers trembling in a way he clearly hoped the court wouldn't notice. There was rage in his eyes, old and weary rage, the rage of a man who loves too much and can't protect enough. "This isn't tiredness. It's her sickness," Aldrich the seer cut in, stepping forward, his voice smooth and oily as ever. "The signs are clear, Your Majesty. Fever, delirium, the body rejecting food. It's the gray moon plague. I've seen it before, in the northern mountains." "You've seen what exactly?" Niklaus's voice dropped an octave, and there was something animal in it, something that made even the nearest guards take a half step back. "Her blood's been tested 3 times this week. They found nothing." "The sickness doesn't always show in the blood, my king," Isolde interjected, smooth, almost gentle. And it was exactly that false gentleness Nina hated most about her. Sometimes it hides, elsewhere. It was foretold, remember? Your Luna's barrenness. Perhaps this is simply another face of the same curse. Nina felt her stomach twist again, but this time it wasn't only the nausea. It was the old wound tearing open. Years of hearing that she was barren, that she was incomplete, that she'd never give the kingdom an heir, spoken and repeated as absolute truth by a seer the king's mother treated like a sacred oracle. She had never believed it. But hearing it again, right there, in front of everyone, still hurt like the first time. "Enough." Niklaus rose, pulling Nina up with him, one arm firm around her waist, holding the weight her legs could no longer hold on their own. "No one speaks my Luna's name in this court again today." "Your Majesty," Aldrich pressed, "if it truly is the plague, she needs to be isolated, for the kingdom's safety, for everyone's safety." The whole hall held its breath. Nina felt Niklaus's body stiffen beside her, felt the barely contained fury in the tensed muscles of the arm holding her up. He wanted to scream, she knew, wanted to tear Aldrich's tongue out by the root. But she also knew, because she'd known him for years, since before they were king and Luna, since back when they were just 2 young wolves running free through the forest with no crown weighing on either of their heads, that he was calculating, always calculating. One step ahead of enemies only he seemed to fully see. "She'll rest," he said finally, his voice regaining control, cold as ice over embers. "In my chambers, alone with me, and whoever disagrees can take it up with me personally, outside, under the moon." No one disagreed. He carried her, literally carried her, ignoring her weak protest, through corridors that seemed longer than they'd ever seemed before, until they reached the royal chambers. Only when the door closed behind them, only when they were finally alone, did Niklas let his face break. "I thought I was going to lose you in there," he whispered, forehead pressed to hers, his voice thick in a way he never let anyone else see. In front of all of them. "I'm not going anywhere," Nina answered, and even weak, even dizzy, there was steel in her voice. "I've survived worse than that nest of vipers." He laughed, short, tired, but real, and kissed her forehead, lingering as if he could seal there all the strength he felt slipping away from him. It was only later, in the dead of night, with Nina finally asleep beside him, her breathing still too unsteady for his liking, that Niklas let the fear take hold. He sat at the edge of the bed, watching the pale face of the woman he loved more than his own life, and thought of Aldrich, of his mother, of the way the two of them traded glances he couldn't quite decode. Something was wrong. Not with her. Never with her. Something was wrong around her. And he'd swear on the moon, on blood, and on the crown that he'd find out what it was. before it was too late. Outside the royal chambers, hidden in the shadows of the corridor, a figure watched it all in silence. Lord Draven had served 3 kings faithfully before Niklaus took the throne, and in each of them he'd seen the same thing: weakness dressed up as honor, sentimentality dressed up as strength. He didn't hate Niklaus. That would be too simple. He simply knew, with the cold certainty of a man who'd spent his life overlooked in council, that the kingdom deserved a king who didn't let his heart command the crown. And if the Luna really was sick, well, maybe this was the chance he'd been waiting years for. Morning arrived gray, the way mornings only do after bad nights. Nina woke with her stomach already churning before she even opened her eyes, and barely had time to sit up in bed before the nausea won. Again? The voice came from the doorway, worried, but with that dry edge only one person in the entire castle had the nerve to use with the Luna. Morella stepped in carrying a basin of water and a cloth, her brown hair carelessly pinned up, her apron already stained with the morning's herbs. That's 4 days now, Nina. 4. I'm counting 2, Morella. Thank you, Nina muttered, forehead resting in her hands, trying to make the room stop spinning. Morella wasn't just a servant. She was the woman who'd changed Nina's diapers when Nina was still an awkward little wolf pup running through the castle halls, back before either of them had any idea Nina would grow up to be Luna of a kingdom that resented her for it. She'd raised her more than Nina's own mother had, and she'd earned the right, a long time ago, to speak to her without a shred of formality. Drink this. Morella set a cup of something bitter-smelling into Nina's hands. Ginger and mint. Won't fix whatever this is, but it'll settle your stomach for an hour, maybe 2. Nina drank, grimacing. Tastes like the bottom of a boot. A boot that keeps you from throwing up on the king's favorite rug, so drink up and be grateful. Despite everything, the fever that came and went, the dizziness, the bone-deep exhaustion, Nina laughed. It came out weak, but real. That was the thing about Morella. Even on the worst days, she found a way to make Nina laugh before she made her cry. The healers came back with nothing again yesterday, Nina said, once the nausea eased enough to speak. No plague markers, no infection, nothing in the blood. And still Aldrich stands in front of the whole court calling it the Grey Moon Plague like he's reading it off a stone tablet. Morella's jaw tightened, the humor draining out of her face for a moment. That man wouldn't recognize a real sickness if it bit him. She sat on the edge of the bed, taking Nina's hand, studying her with the sharp, searching look of someone who'd spent decades reading bodies for truths the person inside them hadn't noticed yet. When was your last moon cycle, Nina? The question landed sideways, and Nina blinked at her, caught off guard. I don't know. It's been a while, I suppose. Weeks. Why? Lie back for me. Morella, lie back. Humor an old woman. Nina huffed but obeyed, easing back against the pillows, watching with growing confusion as Morella pressed both hands gently against her lower stomach, eyes closed, head tilted like she was listening for something rather than feeling for it. The room went quiet except for the crackle of the morning fire and the distant call of birds outside the window. What are you doing? Nina whispered. Hush. Morella's brow furrowed, her hands shifting slightly, pressing a little firmer in one spot, then another. Long seconds passed. Nina watched her face change. Confusion first, then something sharper, more careful, like a woman recounting numbers she didn't trust the first time. Morella, you're scaring me. I'm hearing something, Morella murmured, almost to herself. Wolf hearing's always been sharper than most healers give it credit for, and I swear to you, girl, I am hearing... She stopped, pressed her palms flat again, went utterly still. Her eyes opened, wide, stunned. 5. Nina sat up so fast she nearly knocked Morella's hands away. 5 what? Heartbeats. Morella's voice came out barely above a whisper, shaking in a way Nina had never once heard from her in her entire life. Small ones, fast ones, 5 separate little heartbeats, all going at once, right under my hands. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Nina pressed both hands over her own stomach, over the place Morella's hands had just been, as if she could feel it herself through sheer will alone. That's not possible. I can't. Morella, the seer, said I was barren. Everyone has said it my whole life. You can't just... I know a heartbeat when I hear one, Nina, and I know 5 of them when I hear 5 of them. Morella grabbed both of Nina's hands, gripping tight, tears standing bright and sudden in her eyes. You are not sick, sweet girl. You have never been sick a day in these past weeks. You are pregnant. You are pregnant with 5. Nina couldn't speak. Years of humiliation crashed through her all at once. Every whispered insult in the throne room, every pitying glance from courtiers who thought a barren Luna was a broken one, every time Isolde had smiled that thin, cruel smile and called her incomplete in front of the entire council. All of it, every single word, had been a lie. Not a curse, not a flaw in her body. A lie, built and repeated by people who needed her weak enough to remove. 5, she repeated, the word barely making it past the lump in her throat. How is that even? Wolves don't usually carry more than 1 or 2? No, Morella agreed slowly, wonder and worry tangled together in her voice. They don't. Whatever this is, whoever or whatever is growing inside you, it's not ordinary. I don't know what it means yet, but I know what I heard, and I know it's real. The nausea, the fever, the delirium, all of it rearranged itself instantly in Nina's mind, no longer symptoms of some mysterious plague, but simply her body working harder than any body had ever worked, carrying 5 small lives at once. She pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, half laughing, half sobbing, joy and terror crashing into each other with nowhere to go. Aldrich, she breathed, the joy curdling fast into something colder. Morella, if Aldrich finds out, if Isolde finds out, they can't. Morella's voice snapped back into its familiar briskness, though her hands hadn't stopped trembling. Not yet. Not until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. And definitely not until Niklaus knows before anyone else does. That old woman has spent years building a story that you can't carry in air. If she finds out you're carrying 5, she won't just try to isolate me anymore, Nina finished, the realization settling cold and sharp in her chest. She'll try to make sure none of them survive to be born. The 2 women stared at each other, the warmth of the discovery already tightening into something far more dangerous. Outside the window, a raven landed briefly on the sill, dark eyes glittering, before startling off into the gray morning sky, and Nina found herself wondering, with a chill that had nothing to do with fever, whose eyes it carried the sight back to. We tell no one, Morella said finally, quiet and fierce. Not the healers, not the guards, no one. I'll handle your care myself from now on. And we get you out of this palace before that woman finds a single reason to look at you too closely. Nina nodded, one hand still pressed protectively over her stomach, over 5 impossible, fiercely beating hearts that had just rewritten everything she thought she knew about her own body, and about the danger closing in around her. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't just afraid. She was ready to fight. Nina had not slept. She'd spent the night staring at the ceiling with one hand resting over her stomach, replaying Morella's words on a loop. 5 small heartbeats, until the words stopped sounding real and started sounding like a secret too enormous to carry into a room full of people who wanted her gone. Morella laced her into the sturdiest gown she owned that morning, fingers steady despite everything, murmuring instructions under her breath the whole time. Stand tall. Breathe normal. Let them see nothing but a tired woman, not a frightened one. And for the love of the moon, don't touch your stomach, not even once, not even by accident. I know, Nina said, though her hands itched with the urge to do exactly that. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway, because I need to hear myself say it as much as you need to hear it. Morella adjusted the final pin in Nina's hair, then held her by the shoulders, searching her face. "You can do this." "I have to." The council hall was colder than usual that morning, or maybe it only felt that way because of what Nina now carried inside her, hidden beneath layers of fabric and years of practiced composure. Queen Mother Isolde sat beside the throne, not on it, with Aldrich standing at her side like a shadow given permission to speak. The council members filled the long table, faces carefully arranged into expressions of concern that didn't quite reach their eyes. "The Luna's condition has worsened," Aldrich announced, before anyone else could speak. "2 more healers examined her yesterday. Both confirm the pattern matches the early stages of the Grey Moon Plague. Both of them work for my mother," Niklaus said flatly. "Forgive me if I don't find that particularly reassuring." Nina kept her spine straight, her face composed, though every word out of Aldrich's mouth now sounded different to her ears than it had a day ago. He wasn't just wrong. He was lying, deliberately, precisely, in a way that fit far too neatly into whatever plan he and Isolde had built together. A body that couldn't carry an heir needed no watching. A body carrying 5 needed to disappear before anyone thought to look closely enough to notice. "With respect, Luna," one of the elder council members said carefully, "we cannot take the risk that this is contagious." "It won't spread," Niklaus said, jaw tight. "Because it isn't plague. I've watched plague take a village before. I know what it looks like. This isn't it." "Then what is it, Your Majesty?" Aldrich asked, tilting his head, something almost gleeful buried under the false concern in his voice. Nina felt the answer sitting heavy and dangerous on her tongue. "A miracle," she wanted to say. 5 of them, growing right now, right here, while you stand there calling it a curse, and swallowed it down hard enough to hurt. Not yet. Not in this room, in front of this woman, with this man's cold, calculating eyes fixed on her like he already suspected there was something worth finding. "Perhaps," Isolde said, smooth as still water. "It's simply an illness we don't yet have a name for. All the more reason for isolation, for everyone's safety." The vote took less than a minute. Nina stood perfectly still through all of it, one hand pressed flat against her thigh instead of her stomach, holding herself together through sheer will alone. Isolation, immediate removal from the castle. "This is insane," Niklaus said, rising so fast his chair scraped hard against the stone floor. "She is your Luna. She is my wife. You cannot vote to exile her like she's some criminal." "No one said exile," Isolde replied. "Only isolation. Temporary, of course. Until she's well again. Or until we know for certain she never will be." Nina caught the flicker in Isolde's eyes as she said it. A flicker of something too satisfied, too certain. And for the first time, Nina let herself wonder just how much the old woman actually suspected. Did she know? Had some healer, some spy, some careless word passed between servants already reached her? Or was this simply cruelty for its own sake? The same cruelty Isolde had aimed at Nina for years, now sharpened by circumstance into something far more dangerous than either of them yet realized. "Fine," Nina said, and the single word silenced the whole hall. "Nina?" Niklaus started. "Fine," she repeated, turning to face him, steady, unshaken, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she feared he might hear it too. "I'll go." That night, in the privacy of their chambers, the fury finally broke free, and so did the secret. "I am not sending you to some isolation house your mother controls," Niklaus said, pacing, hands raking through his hair, voice raw. "I don't trust a single person she'd assign to guard you." "Niklaus." Nina caught his hand, stilling him mid-stride, and something in her voice made him go instantly quiet. "Sit down. There's something you need to know before we plan anything else." He sat, slow and wary, watching her face for whatever storm he could already sense building behind her eyes. "I'm not sick," she said. I never was. She told him everything. The missed cycles she'd barely noticed through the chaos of the court. Mirella's hands pressed careful and searching against her stomach. The impossible, wondrous, terrifying number Mirella had counted beneath her palms. She watched his face move through disbelief, then dawning hope. Then something that broke entirely open when she finally said the word 5. 5, he repeated, voice cracking, both hands coming to rest gently, reverently, over her stomach like he was afraid she might vanish if he pressed too hard. Nina, 5. I know. The seer lied. His voice hardened instantly, grief and fury tangling together so fast Nina barely had time to track the shift. He's known this whole time you weren't barren. He built that lie for my mother years ago, and he's been building on top of it ever since. And now he's using it to convince the entire council to throw you out of the palace while you're carrying. He stopped, pressed his forehead to her stomach, breathing unsteady. They can't know, not yet. Not until I understand exactly what they're planning and exactly how far they're willing to go to make sure this pregnancy never becomes public. That's why isolation actually helps us now, Nina said quietly, threading her fingers through his hair. Not the palace's isolation house. Somewhere further. Somewhere no healer of hers can reach me, no raven can trace me. I carry this pregnancy in secret, far from her eyes, until it's far enough along that no seer's lie can undo it. Niklaus lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed but fierce with a resolve Nina hadn't seen in him in weeks. The old castle north of here, my grandfather's. No one set foot there in decades. Then that's where we go. Months, Nina, without contact. If ravens carry messages between us, someone traces them straight back to you and to them. His hand tightened over her stomach, protective and desperate all at once. I can't lose any of you. Not now. Not when I've only just found out you exist. You won't, Nina said, though the words cost her more than she let show. I have Mirella. I have 5 reasons now to fight harder than I've ever fought for anything in my life. Whatever your mother and Aldrich are building, we'll be ready for it. Because this time, we know something they don't. He kissed her then, slow and desperate, one hand still pressed protectively low over her stomach, memorizing warmth and heartbeat. 6 now instead of 2. Because both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that everything about to come would demand every ounce of strength they had left to give. Outside their window, hidden in the shadows just beyond the palace walls, Lord Draven watched the lit window of the royal chambers and noted, with quiet interest, the unusual hour of the king's visible relief. A relief that didn't match the tired, frightened man who'd left the council chamber only hours before. Draven didn't yet know what had changed behind that window, but he'd learned long ago that sudden hope in a desperate man's eyes almost always meant a secret worth uncovering. They rode for 2 days through forest so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground, and by the time the old castle rose out of the mist ahead of them, Nina's whole body ached in ways that had nothing to do with the secret she now carried so carefully beneath her cloak. Niklaus rode close beside her the entire way, one hand never far from the reins of her horse, watching her with a new kind of vigilance. Not just a husband's worry anymore, but the fierce, constant watchfulness of a man guarding 5 lives he'd only just learned existed. Slower, he called for the 3rd time that hour when her horse picked up pace over uneven ground. Niklaus, I'm pregnant. Not made of spun glass. Humor me. The castle itself looked like something out of an old story. Gray stone swallowed by ivy, towers leaning slightly with age, windows dark and empty as unblinking eyes. It had belonged to Niklaus's grandfather once, and no one had lived within its walls since. Dust and silence had made themselves at home instead. It's not much, Niklaus said, helping Nina down from her horse with exaggerated care, his hands lingering at her waist, one palm briefly, instinctively, sliding to rest over her stomach before he caught himself. But it's safe. No one else's eyes on you here." "It's perfect," Nina said, and meant it, even as a chill crept up her spine at the sheer emptiness of the place. Morella slid off her own horse with brisk efficiency, already surveying the courtyard with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman calculating exactly how many things needed fixing before nightfall. "Right, first things first. Someone needs to check these chimneys. And I want a proper bed made up for Nina before anything else. None of this dusty mattress nonsense. She's not sleeping on anything that hasn't been aired out." "There's a kitchen through there," Nicholas offered. "It'll need work. Everything will." "Good. I like work." Morella shot Nina a pointed look, the kind that had become their private shorthand this past week, a look that said careful without needing the word. "Your Majesty, before you ride back tomorrow, I want a full accounting of every herb you can have smuggled to me without anyone noticing. Raspberry leaf, ginger, the usual, but more of it than you'd think we'd need. 5 sets of needs add up fast." Nicholas's throat worked visibly at the reminder, wonder and fear crossing his face in equal measure. "I'll have it sent before I leave the border town. No markings. No Raven Trail back here." That night, after Morella retreated with a mumbled excuse about the chimneys needing checking, Nina and Niklaus sat together by the fire in what would become her chambers, his hand resting where it had barely left all day, low against her stomach, like he could will himself to feel something this early just by sheer wanting. "I keep thinking about all the years everyone told us, that this could never happen," he said quietly, watching the flames. "My mother used it like a blade against you for a decade, and it was never even true." "Don't," Nina said gently, covering his hand with hers. "Don't spend tonight angry. We don't have many nights left before you have to go back and pretend none of this happened. I don't want to spend them angry." He exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, though not all of it. She doubted anything would fully ease that particular tension until Aldrich and Isolde no longer had breath to lie with. 3 months, he said instead. Maybe 4, until the fever excuse has cooled enough that I can start finding reasons to visit without suspicion. I'll come the moment I can. I swear it. I know you will. No contact in between. No ravens, no letters. Anything at all could be traced back here. And if they learn about this before I've secured enough power to protect all of you... His hand tightened, protective, over her stomach. I know, Nicholas. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her instead of the fire. I have Morella. I have 5 reasons to survive anything they try. Go back, play the grieving husband, find out exactly how deep Draven and Aldrich's plans go, and come back to us when it's safe. We'll be here. He kissed her, slow and reverent, one hand still resting protectively low, and when he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet in a way he didn't bother hiding anymore. Not from her. Not tonight. He left at dawn, before Nina was fully awake, unable to trust himself to say goodbye to her face without breaking every promise about staying away. She woke to Morella already sitting at the edge of her bed, a cup of ginger tea waiting, expression softer than usual. He's gone, Morella said simply. Left before sunrise. Very dramatic. Kissed your stomach on his way out, which I pretended not to see, out of respect. Nina laughed, low and thick with sleep, one hand finding her stomach instinctively. Still flat, still betraying nothing to the naked eye, holding its enormous secret in perfect silence. 5 weeks now. Feels impossible. Feels real to me, Morella said, settling in beside her with the tea. Now drink up. We've months of work ahead of us before that man rides back through the gate, and I intend for him to find you stronger than he left you, not just further along. 2 days south, Niklaus rode back toward a palace that had grown colder in his absence, carrying a secret heavier and brighter than anything he'd ever held, already calculating, already planning, already promising himself that whatever Draven and his mother were building in the shadows, he would tear it down piece by piece before he let it touch the 5 impossible heartbeats now beating somewhere north, safe, hidden, and entirely his to protect. 2 months into their strange new life, Nina had learned 3 things with absolute certainty. She was terrible at making bread. She was getting better with a blade than the guard captain back home ever gave her credit for. And pregnancy with 5 apparently meant an appetite fierce enough to frighten even Morella. "That's the 3rd bowl," Morella said, watching Nina finish off a 2nd helping of stew before she'd even set down the 1st empty bowl. "I'm hungry." "You're hungry enough to feed a small army is what you are." Morella slid a piece of bread across the table anyway, no real complaint behind the words. 5 of them in there, all wanting their share. I suppose it adds up quick. Nina rested a hand over the small, undeniable curve, now pressing gently against her waistband. Too early to be showing this much by any account Morella had ever witnessed with a single child, which only confirmed, again and again, just how unusual this pregnancy truly was. "Do you think it's normal, growing this fast?" "Nothing about this is normal, sweet girl. And I stopped expecting normal the morning I counted 5 heartbeats under my own 2 hands. Morella's tone stayed light, but her eyes lingered, thoughtful, on the curve of Nina's stomach a beat too long. "Strong, though. Whatever they are, however fast they're growing. They're strong. I trust that more than I trust anything Aldrich's ever said about anyone's body." Training had changed since the confirmation, though Nina had fought Morella hard on that front in the early weeks. Morella refused to let her spar full force anymore, refused to let her take falls she'd once shrugged off easily, and their daily arguments over it had become an odd, comforting ritual all their own. "I am not made of glass," Nina insisted that morning, for perhaps the 100th time, as Morella guided her through a slower drill instead of letting her charge forward the way she wanted to. "No. But you're carrying 5 very small, very important reasons to stop pretending you are invincible. So we go slow. We build strength instead of recklessness. And you stop glaring at me like I've betrayed you every time I say ease up." Morella corrected the angle of Nina's wrist with a gentle tap, patient despite her sharp tone. Besides, a Luna who can still put a blade through a man's throat while 5 months pregnant with quintuplets is a far more terrifying thing than one who never had to. Let them underestimate you. It'll be their mistake to make when they finally come looking. Nina huffed a laugh, but let the pace slow, let herself feel the truth of it settle into her bones. Something had deepened between the 2 of them these past months. Morella had always been close to a mother, but out here, alone, stripped of titles and court and the constant threat hanging over every word Nina used to speak in council, that bond had become something neither of them fully had words for. Morella taught her to fight smarter, to cook something besides burnt bread, to track weather in the color of the sky, and in exchange, Nina had given her someone to fuss over, to protect fiercely, to love without a single ounce of restraint. "Do you think Aldrich suspects anything yet?" Nina asked later, shelling beans on the kitchen steps, the autumn sun warm against her shoulders, one hand resting where it always seemed to rest lately. "I think," Morella said slowly, "that a man who built his entire career on convincing an entire kingdom you were barren does not enjoy the quiet. Quiet makes men like that nervous. No new rumors to spread, no fresh symptoms to twist into his lies, just silence, stretching on, month after month, while the woman he swore was dying and childless is nowhere to be found." She glanced sideways at Nina. "That kind of silence makes men like him dig. And men like him don't stop digging until they find something, even if they have to invent it." Nina's hand tightened over her stomach, instinctive, protective. "If he ever finds out what's really growing in here, he won't," Morella said, firm and immediate. "Not from us, not from carelessness, not from anything either of us controls. And if he ever gets close enough to try, he'll have to go through me first, and I promise you, girl, I've buried men more dangerous than a court seer with a silver tongue and no spine to back it." Nina managed a real laugh at that, some of the tension easing from her shoulders, though it never fully left these days. Not since the number 5 had rearranged everything she understood about her own body, her own worth, and the danger now curled tight and constant beneath every quiet moment of peace they managed to steal in this borrowed castle. 2 days' ride south, in a palace growing colder by the week, Niklaus stood alone on his balcony overlooking a courtyard he no longer fully trusted, watching Lord Draven cross toward the council hall flanked by men who answered to no one Niklaus could readily identify. Something was shifting in the palace's foundations while his back was turned, slow and deliberate, and every week that passed without word from Nina felt like another week the ground grew less solid beneath his feet. Another week further from the 5 small lives he'd promised himself. Silently, fiercely, he would tear the whole kingdom apart to protect. He gripped the balcony rail until his knuckles whitened, picturing her face, picturing a hand resting low over a stomach he'd only touched once before. Duty tore him away from her, and swore again to whatever gods still listened to Alpha Kings that whatever Draven was building in the shadows, he would burn it to the ground before he let it so much as brush against his family. The letter arrived on a morning already gone wrong in a dozen smaller ways, and Niklaus knew, the moment he broke the seal, that it would be the piece that finally brought the whole crumbling structure of his patience down. Regent Advisor Draven, it read, in his mother's precise, elegant hand, shall assume oversight of the treasury and palace guard during the crown's period of grief and distraction, as voted by council in the king's absence from the northern border inspection. They voted while I was gone, Niklaus said quietly, more to himself than to the guard still standing at attention nearby, one of the few men left in the palace he trusted without reservation. They waited until I was 3 days' ride away and pushed it through without me. Your Majesty, half the council didn't even... I know exactly how it happened. Niklaus's voice stayed low, controlled, though the guard took an involuntary step back from whatever was building behind his king's eyes. My mother has been planning this for months, maybe longer, and I was so busy trying to keep my wife hidden and safe that I let her build a cage around me one decree at a time. He thought of Nina then. 5 months gone now since he'd last held her, 5 months of silence he'd sworn to keep for her safety, and felt the rage in his chest curdle into something colder, more useful. Fury that shouted got a man killed. Fury that calculated got a man his kingdom back. He spent the following weeks watching, cataloging, calling in debts owed to him from lords who still remembered which king had stood by their territories during the border famine 3 winters past. He moved carefully, quietly, the way Nina herself might have moved through that same court, and found, to his grim satisfaction, that he'd learned more from her example over the years than he'd ever fully given her credit for. It wasn't enough. Draven struck first, sooner and harder than Niklaus had prepared for. It happened on a night thick with fog, guards loyal to Draven quietly replacing the ones loyal to the crown at every gate and corridor, until Niklaus woke to the sound of boots outside his chambers that didn't belong to men he recognized. Your Majesty. The guard who burst through his door wasn't one of Draven's, one of the last few Niklaus still trusted, face pale, breathing hard. They've taken the East Wing. Draven's declared the council dissolved, says your grief has made you unfit to rule, says your mother's agreed to serve as regent until you're recovered. Recovered from what? Niklaus was already moving, pulling on boots, strapping a blade to his side with hands that had gone perfectly steady, now that the moment had actually arrived. From a sickness that was never real in the first place? There's no time, Your Majesty. They're moving through the West Corridor now. If you don't leave within the hour... Niklaus didn't need to hear the rest. He'd planned for this, in the quiet, calculating corner of his mind that had never fully believed his mother would stop at anything less than total control. He grabbed the small pack he'd kept ready for exactly this possibility, the one item inside it he cared about beyond his own survival. Nina's letter, the one she'd smuggled to him months ago through a route so careful it had taken 3 trusted hands to deliver, the only piece of contact they'd allowed themselves in all these long months apart. He went out through the old servants' passage his grandfather had shown him as a boy, the same passage he realized with a grim, aching irony that led eventually toward the North Road, toward her. He rode through the night and half the following day without stopping, exhaustion and fury and a terror he refused to name driving him faster than any horse should reasonably have carried a man. He thought of Draven's men swarming through halls that had been his home his entire life. He thought of his mother's face, calm and satisfied, finally getting exactly what she'd wanted all along. And beneath all of it, underneath every furious, grief-soaked thought, he thought of Nina. 5 months pregnant now with 5 impossible lives, waiting in a castle he'd promised to return to the moment it was safe. It wasn't safe. It might never be safe again. But he was done waiting for safety to hand him permission to go to her. By the time the old castle rose out of the mist ahead of him, 2 days later, his horse was nearly spent beneath him, and he wasn't much better off himself. Unshaven, hollow-eyed, riding in on instinct alone. He didn't announce himself. He simply rode through the gate, dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, and walked into the courtyard like a man who'd been holding his breath for 6 months and had finally remembered how to breathe. And there, in the fading afternoon light, sword in hand mid-drill with Morella across from her, stood Nina. Not the fragile, fevered woman he'd left behind, but someone entirely transformed. Steady on her feet despite the unmistakable 6 months round curve of her stomach. Fierce, unbroken, radiant in a way that stole every furious, grief-soaked thought clean out of his head and left only her name. "Nicholas," she breathed, lowering the practice sword, and for one long, suspended moment neither of them moved at all. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the courtyard holding its breath around them, the fading light, the distant caw of a crow somewhere over the tree line, Morella quietly lowering her practice sword and taking a slow step back, giving them space without ever quite leaving. Then Niklaus crossed the distance in 3 strides and pulled Nina into his arms so fast she nearly lost her footing, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other splayed wide and careful over the curve of her stomach, like he needed to confirm with his own palm what his eyes were already telling him. "You're real," he breathed against her hair. "You're actually real." Last I checked. Nina's voice came out thick, tears she hadn't given herself permission to cry in 6 months finally slipping free. "You look terrible. I rode 2 days without stopping. I can smell that." A startled laugh broke out of him, rough and disbelieving, muffled against her hair, and for a moment he simply held her, breathing her in, memorizing the solid, living weight of her against him after months of nothing but memory to survive on. Then his hand moved again, slow and reverent, tracing the shape of her stomach, and his breath caught audibly. 6 months, he said. "You're Nina. Look at you. Getting harder to hide a sword under my cloak, that's for certain." She caught his face in both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes, searching them for whatever had put those new hollows beneath them, that raw, wired exhaustion she'd never once seen on him, even in the worst days at court. "Nicholas, what happened? You weren't supposed to come for another 3 months. Something's wrong." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the joy of the reunion cracked straight down the middle, letting the fury underneath show through. "Draven happened. My mother happened. They moved while I was away inspecting the border, pushed a vote through council naming him regent advisor, and 3 nights ago his men took the east wing while I slept." His hands curled into fists at his sides, voice dropping into something low and dangerous. "I'm not king of anything right now, Nina. I'm a man who ran." "You're a man who survived," Morella cut in sharply, finally stepping forward, arms crossed, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. There's a difference, and don't you dare confuse the two in front of me, Your Majesty, or I'll knock some sense into you myself, crown or no crown. Despite everything, Niklaus huffed something close to a laugh. It's good to see you too, Morella. Flattery won't save you from the scolding you've earned. 6 months without a single word, and you show up looking like you fought a bear and lost. She softened, just slightly, reaching up to grip his shoulder the way she might have gripped a son's. But you're here, and that matters more than the state of your beard. Gods help you. They moved inside as the light faded fully, Morella bustling immediately into motion, water heating, food appearing on the table faster than Niklaus could track, blankets produced from somewhere with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd apparently been quietly preparing for exactly this arrival for weeks. Niklaus ate like a starving man, which he essentially was, while Nina sat pressed against his side, unwilling to put more than an inch of space between them, one of his hands resting permanently over her stomach, as if he could make up for 6 months of absence through sheer proximity alone. Tell me everything, he said, once the worst of his hunger had eased. From the beginning, I want to know all of it. So she did. The missed cycle, Morella's hands pressed searching against her stomach, the number that had rearranged everything Nina thought she knew about her own body. The months of training, of learning to fight properly, of burnt bread and stolen laughter, and the slow, steady terror of wondering every single day whether he was safe, whether Draven or Isolde had found some new way to close in. 5, Niklaus said again, like the word still hadn't fully settled into something real, even after everything Morella had already confirmed to him herself while Nina finished the last of her stew. His hand spread wide over the curve of her belly, and something in his face broke open, raw and unguarded, in a way Nina had rarely seen from him even in their most private moments. I spent years believing I'd never have this, that we'd never have this. And this whole time it was never true. Nina finished quietly. None of it. Not the barrenness, not the sickness, not any of it. It was all just a story your mother needed people to believe. The tenderness in his expression curdled fast into something colder, harder, the same calculating fury she'd seen in him the night they'd first fled the palace. She's had that seer lying for her for years, maybe from the very beginning. I need to know how deep it goes. Whether she knew about this pregnancy specifically, or whether she was simply cruel enough to build a lie this large without ever once wondering if it was true. Does it matter? Nina asked. Either way, she tried to erase me from your life rather than let me stand beside you as your equal. Either way, Aldrich has spent years poisoning people's trust in me with lies he knew were lies. The reason doesn't change what they did. No, Niklaus agreed, low and rough. But it changes what I do next. Morella, clearing the table with more force than strictly necessary, made a small, disapproving noise. What you do next, Your Majesty, is sleep. You've ridden 2 days without rest. You're half out of your mind with exhaustion, and no plan built on top of that kind of tired ever survives contact with reality. Whatever revenge you're planning will keep until morning. Revenge isn't the word I'd choose, Niklaus said, though the ghost of a humorless smile crossed his face. Call it whatever pretty word makes you feel better about it. I've raised enough hot-headed young men in my life to know exhaustion makes fools of even the smartest ones. She jerked her chin toward the stairs. Bed. Both of you. The kingdom will still be a mess in the morning, and you'll be far more useful to your wife and your 5 little secrets with a clear head. Niklaus opened his mouth to argue, caught the look on Nina's face, equal parts amusement and unmistakable agreement, and closed it again with a resigned sigh. You've clearly spent 6 months teaching her to gang up on me. I taught her to survive, Morella corrected, though her eyes crinkled with something warm and fond. Ganging up on stubborn kings was simply a bonus skill she picked up on her own. Later, lying together in the dark for the first time in 6 months, Niklaus's hand never left the curve of Nina's stomach, tracing slow, absent circles as though he could commit the shape of it to memory through touch alone. Nina drifted toward sleep to the sound of his voice, low and unsteady, murmuring promises to 5 children he'd never met and already loved beyond measure. Promises about a kingdom worth inheriting, about a mother who would never again be made to feel small in her own home, about a throne he intended to reclaim, not for the crown itself, but for every single one of them. Outside, the moon hung full and silent over the old castle, over the fragile, fierce peace they'd built inside its walls, a peace neither of them yet knew was already being hunted, as a raven, dark-eyed and patient, circled once above the northern road before turning south again, carrying word of exactly where the missing king had gone. Niklaus woke before dawn out of old habit, reaching instinctively for Nina before he was even fully conscious, and found her already awake beside him, one hand resting on her stomach, watching the gray light shift slowly across the ceiling. "You didn't sleep," he murmured. "I slept, just not much." She turned into him, tucking herself against his side. 6 months of quiet, and the one night you're finally here? My mind won't stop running through everything Draven could be doing right now. That makes 2 of us. He pressed a kiss to her temple, then lower to her stomach, lingering there a moment before straightening. "We need to talk, properly. Not just about what happened, about what we do next." They found Morella already in the kitchen, predictably, bread rising under a cloth and a pot of something fragrant simmering over the fire. She took one look at both their faces and set down her spoon. "That's not a breakfast face. That's a war council face." "It's both, hopefully," Niklaus said, dropping into a chair at the table. "I'd like your opinion, Morella. You've kept Nina alive and thriving for 6 months in a castle neither of us had set foot in for decades. I trust your judgment more than half the men I used to call advisors." Morella raised an eyebrow, clearly startled by the sincerity of it, then recovered with a snort. "Careful, Your Majesty. Compliments like that will go straight to my head, and then who'll keep the 2 of you fed and alive?" But she pulled out a chair and sat, all business now. "Tell me what we're working with." Niklaus laid it out plainly, Draven's men holding the East Wing, the forged vote naming him Regent Advisor, his mother's calm, satisfied face as the council dissolved around her. "The lords who still favor me are scattered, some in their own territories, some likely too frightened to act without proof I'm still alive and capable of holding the throne. I need to reach them. I need proof of Draven's overreach that the wider council can't simply vote away." "And Aldrich?" Nina asked quietly. Niklaus's jaw tightened. "Aldrich is the thread that unravels all of it, if we pull it right. He lied about a plague. He's been lying about your fertility for years. Probably for money. Probably for whatever promises Draven or my mother made him. If I can get even one healer to testify publicly that there was never any plague, that the entire diagnosis was fabricated." "You'll need more than one healer," Morella said. "You'll need someone the council actually trusts, someone with no reason to lie for you." She tapped the table thoughtfully. "There's a healer 2 villages east of here. Old woman, trained half the midwives in this region before she retired. She examined me once, years ago, before I ever set foot in the palace. She'd know how to identify a real plague from a fabricated one, and she's got no love for Aldrich. He tried to have her license revoked once for contradicting him." "You know her?" "I know most people worth knowing in 3 provinces, Your Majesty. Comes from decades of minding other people's business." Morella's mouth twitched. "I can reach her. Carefully. It'll take time." "Time," Niklaus repeated, something bitter in his voice. "Draven's had 6 months already, and he moved the moment I turned my back for 3 days. I don't know how much time we actually have left to be careful." Nina reached over, covering his clenched fist with her hand. "Then we don't waste what we have arguing about whether to be careful. We plan around it." She looked between them both, something steady and fierce settling into her expression. The same look Niklaus remembered from council meetings years ago, when she'd stood her ground against elders 3 times her age and refused to back down. "I'm not hiding in this castle while you ride back into danger alone, Nicholas. I fought Morella on this for months, and I'll fight you too if I have to. Nina, you're 6 months pregnant with 5 reasons to make absolutely certain Draven and your mother never sit comfortably on a throne meant for our children," she finished. "I'm not asking to march into battle. I'm asking to be part of the plan instead of a secret you're protecting from a distance. There's a difference, and I think you know it." He studied her for a long moment, old frustration and old love warring visibly across his face. And Morella, watching the exchange with poorly concealed amusement, finally cut in. "For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I've spent 6 months training this woman to fight, and she's better with a blade now than half your palace guard ever was. Underestimating her got your mother exactly nowhere for the better part of a decade. I wouldn't recommend making the same mistake." Niklaus huffed something between a laugh and a sigh, finally nodding. "Fine. You're part of the plan, but you are not riding into the palace itself until I know it's secured enough to be safe." "I can accept that," Nina said, satisfied. 2 days' ride south, in what remained of the palace he'd so carefully maneuvered himself into controlling, Lord Draven stood at the window of his newly claimed study, watching a raven settle onto the sill outside with a small scroll bound to its leg. He'd sent that particular bird north weeks ago, tracking the king's most trusted remaining guard, certain the man would eventually lead him somewhere worth knowing about. He unrolled the scroll and read the brief coded message twice before allowing himself the smallest, coldest smile. Old Castle. North Road. King arrived 3 nights past. Luna present. Confirmed pregnant. Draven set the scroll down slowly, turning the information over with the same careful patience that had gotten him this far. He'd never hated Niklaus, not really. Hatred was a wasteful, undisciplined emotion, and Draven had built his entire life around discipline. He'd simply watched, for 3 kings running, how sentiment rotted good governance from the inside out. Kings who let love dictate policy. Kings who protected the weak at the expense of the strong. He'd served men like that his whole career, watched them make catastrophic decisions out of tenderness, and told himself each time that the next king would be different, would be harder, would understand that a kingdom needed a spine of iron rather than a heart soft enough to bruise. Nicholas had promised to be that king once, in the early years of his reign. Draven remembered it clearly. A young alpha, fierce and disciplined, who'd seemed poised to finally break the pattern. And then he'd fallen for a woman who argued in council chambers and hunted alongside warriors, and every hard edge Draven had once respected in him had softened piece by piece into something Draven no longer recognized as fit to rule. A pregnancy changed things, though. Draven turned that fact over carefully, weighing it. An heir, 5 of them, if the message could be trusted, was not simply an inconvenience to remove quietly. It was a legitimacy Niklaus could rally the wavering lords around, a symbol powerful enough to undo everything Draven had spent 6 months carefully constructing. He would need to move before the king returned with proof of that legitimacy in hand. Before the wavering lords remembered exactly why they'd once knelt so willingly to Niklaus's father, and his father before him. Draven called for his second-in-command, a quiet, capable man named Corwin who'd served him loyally since the border campaigns years ago and began, methodically, to plan a strike north. One designed not simply to reclaim a wayward king, but to ensure that whatever legitimacy that pregnancy might offer never had the chance to matter at all. Behind him, on the wall of his study, hung the old crest of his own family line, a line that had served kings faithfully for 3 generations without ever once being permitted to wear the crown themselves. Draven touched it briefly, the closest thing to sentiment he allowed himself these days, and told himself, as he always did, that everything he was about to do was simply what discipline required. The attack came at dusk, 3 days after Niklaus's arrival, with the particular cruelty of catching them at their most unguarded hour. Nina was in the courtyard with Morella, working through a slower drill in the fading light, 7 months of pregnancy now rounding her stomach in a way no cloak could disguise anymore, when the first horn sounded from the tree line beyond the castle walls. "That's not one of ours," Morella said instantly, dropping her practice sword and grabbing the real one propped against the wall instead. Niklaus was already moving, bursting out of the castle with his sword half drawn, face gone hard and focused in a way Nina had only seen once before, the night they'd first fled the palace together. "How many?" "Can't tell yet," called the guard from the wall. One of the 3 men who'd followed Niklaus north, fiercely loyal, painfully outnumbered. "Riders. Maybe a dozen. Draven's colors. He found us." Niklaus's voice went flat, cold. The fury banked down into something far more dangerous than shouting. He turned to Nina, and for one unguarded moment the fear underneath the calculation broke through entirely. "You need to get inside. Now." "I'm not hiding while you—" "Nina." He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "I have 5 reasons standing right in front of me why I need you inside those walls and not on this field. Please, not this time." Something in his voice, raw, pleading, stripped of every careful royal composure he usually wore even with her, made her nod, throat tight. "Morella stays with me." "Morella stays with you," he agreed, already turning back toward the gate, sword fully drawn now, calling orders to the 3 guards scrambling into position along the wall. Morella pulled Nina back inside, bolting the heavy door behind them, moving through the castle with practiced efficiency toward the small stone cellar she'd quietly outfitted months ago. For exactly this possibility, Nina realized now, understanding with a jolt just how carefully this woman had been preparing for danger even in their quietest days. "You knew this might happen," Nina said, following her down the narrow stairs. "I've buried enough people in my life to know that quiet never lasts as long as you want it to." Morella lit a small lamp, illuminating the cellar, stocked, Nina saw now, with food, water, blankets, even a second blade tucked into the corner. "Sit, breathe, and do not, for the love of the moon, try to be a hero tonight. Those 5 need you whole more than this kingdom needs one more sword on the field." Above them, muffled through stone, the sounds of battle began. Shouts, the clash of steel, the terrible guttural sounds of men fighting for their lives. Nina sat with one hand pressed to her stomach, feeling the frantic flutter of movement inside her that she'd come to recognize over the past months, and prayed to every version of the moon goddess she'd ever been taught to believe in that Niklaus would walk back through that door. The fighting lasted longer than Nina could bear to count. When it finally quieted, the silence felt almost worse than the noise had, heavy, uncertain, stretching on until Nina thought she might scream just to break it. Then footsteps on the stairs. Uneven. Slow. Morella had the second blade raised before the door even opened, but it was Niklaus who stumbled through it, one arm pressed hard against a wound at his side, blood soaking through his shirt, face pale but alive. "Niklaus!" Nina was on her feet instantly, ignoring Morella's protest, catching him before his knees fully buckled. "I'm all right," he gasped, though the gray tinge to his face said otherwise. "We held them. Lost one of the guards. Edric. He didn't make it." Grief flashed raw across his face before the exhaustion swallowed it whole. The rest of Draven's men retreated. They weren't prepared for a real fight, I think. Just expected to catch us unguarded. Morella was already moving, pulling his shirt aside to examine the wound with brisk, practiced hands. Deep, but not fatal, if we're quick about it. "Sit, now, before you fall down and make my job harder." He sat, wincing, and Nina knelt beside him, gripping his hand hard enough to hurt, terror only now catching up to her now that the danger itself had passed. "You could have died. I didn't. That's not the point, Niklaus." Her voice cracked, 6 months of fear and love and fury finally spilling over all at once. "They found us. They know where we are now. This, she gestured around them, at the cellar, at the blood, at everything. This was supposed to be safe. I know. He caught her face in his free hand, thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped despite her best effort to hold it back. I know, and I'm sorry, and I don't have a clean answer for what comes next except that we can't stay here any longer. Not now that Draven knows exactly where to send more men. Morella, working quickly to clean and bind the wound at his side, spoke without looking up. Then we don't run blind. We go to my healer contact, the one 2 villages east. She'll have safer walls than these, allies Draven doesn't know about yet, and the proof you need about Aldrich's lies sitting right there waiting to be gathered. She tied off the bandage with a firm tug that made Niklaus hiss through his teeth. Sitting here waiting for the next attack helps no one. Moving forward does. Niklaus nodded slowly, some of the color returning to his face now that the wound was properly tended. She's right. We stop reacting to Draven's moves and start making our own. He looked at Nina, something fierce and determined settling back into his eyes despite the exhaustion. 7 months. We don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment anymore. Every week we stay hidden is a week Draven consolidates power I'll have to fight harder to take back. Then we move, Nina said, steadier now, the fear in her chest hardening into resolve. Together, all 3 of us, and whatever guards you have left. 2, Niklaus said grimly. We lost Edric tonight, and Corin took an arrow to the shoulder. It's just Bram left uninjured. The weight of that settled heavy over all of them. A king with 2 guards, a stolen throne, a pregnant Luna carrying the kingdom's only true heirs, and a healer's cottage 2 villages east as their only remaining hope of turning the tide. Nina felt the enormity of it pressing down, and beneath it, something else entirely. The same stubborn, unbreakable resolve that had carried her through years of court contempt, through months of hidden pregnancy, through a night of watching the man she loved ride off to fight for both their lives. Then 2 guards, 1 healer's proof, and everything we have left is exactly what we use, she said. We've survived worse odds than this. Niklaus looked at her for a long moment, pale, exhausted, wounded, and still, somehow, looking at her like she was the single steadiest thing left in a world rapidly falling apart around them. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. No, Morella cut in, gathering up her medical supplies with brisk efficiency, though her eyes were suspiciously bright again. You don't. But she picked you anyway, God's help her. So the least you can do is survive long enough to be worth the trouble. She headed for the stairs, pausing at the top to look back at both of them. We leave at first light. Rest while you can. Tomorrow we fight smarter instead of just harder. Outside, in the ruined courtyard, the bodies of Draven's fallen men lay scattered beneath a moon that had witnessed, in its long, silent watch over that old castle, both the quiet birth of an impossible hope and now the first true blood spilled in its defense. A warning, clear and unmistakable, that whatever peace they'd built these past months was over, and the true fight for the kingdom had only just begun. The healer's cottage smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, tucked into a hollow 2 villages east where Draven's men had not yet thought to look. Old Yara, sharp-eyed, silver-haired, exactly as formidable as Morella had promised, examined Nina with brisk, careful hands the morning after their arrival, then went still, both palms pressed flat against the curve of Nina's stomach, head tilted the way Morella's had been months ago in that first stunned discovery. 5 heartbeats, Yara murmured. Yes, Morella wasn't exaggerating. But she didn't move her hands away. She stayed like that, frowning, counting something Nina couldn't hear. There's a rhythm to them, not random. They beat almost in sequence, one after another, like a chant repeating. Is that dangerous? Niklaus asked, immediately tense. I don't know what it is, Yara admitted, straightening slowly. In 50 years of catching children into this world, I've never heard 5 hearts fall into step with each other like that. It isn't sickness. It isn't strain. She looked at Nina with something between wonder and caution. It's old magic, or I'm no healer at all. 5. Born together, hearts already moving as one before they've even drawn breath. There are stories about that, old ones, from before your grandfather's time, Your Majesty. A litter born in perfect unity was once considered a sign the pack itself was choosing to be reborn stronger through them. Not a curse. A renewal. Nina pressed a hand to her stomach, something settling in her chest at the words. Not quite understanding it fully, but recognizing, instinctively, that whatever she carried was never meant to be hidden away and called diseased. It was meant to be exactly what it was. Something the kingdom itself, in some old, forgotten way, had been waiting for. Whatever it means, Niklaus said quietly, it explains why my mother's seer needed a lie enormous enough to bury it. A prophecy like that, tied to Nina, tied to an heir no one could control or dismiss. That's not something Aldrich invents by accident. Someone told him to bury it before it ever had the chance to be believed. Over the following 2 weeks, while Nina's due date crept closer, Yara's testimony became the cornerstone of everything Niklaus needed. Bram rode to the scattered loyal lords, and slowly, quietly, promises of support returned. Word reached them that Draven, panicking as his support eroded, had pushed the Queen Mother into declaring Niklaus formally unfit to rule. He's panicking, Niklaus said. Good. Panicking men make mistakes. They rode for the palace 3 days later. Niklaus, Nina, Morella, Yara, Bram, and 6 lords who'd finally committed. At the final crossroads before the palace gates, Bram excused himself to scout ahead, as he had a dozen times before, and Nina thought nothing of it until the ambush hit them from the tree line an hour later. Draven's men, waiting in exactly the spot no one but their own party should have known they'd pass. He knew our route, Niklaus snarled, sword already drawn, shielding Nina with his body. Someone told him. It was Morella, scanning the trees with narrowed eyes, who found the answer first. Bram, standing calm and unbothered among the attacking soldiers instead of fighting them, his blade never once raised against Draven's men. Bram. Niklaus's voice cracked with something rawer than fury. You've served my house for 6 years. I served your father, Bram said, not unkindly, almost regretful. He paid his men. You gave us speeches about honor and expected loyalty to feed our families on its own. Draven pays in gold, Your Majesty. Honor doesn't. The lords who'd ridden with them, 6 strong and freshly committed, turned their blades on the ambushers without hesitation, and the fight that followed was brief and vicious. Nina, unable to simply stand aside this time with the road blocked on both sides, found herself at the center of it, not hiding, but directing, calling out formations she'd learned from Morella's months of drilling, rallying 2 of the younger lord's men who'd frozen at the sudden violence into a defensive line that held the road until Draven's ambush finally broke and scattered. "Regroup on me," she shouted, voice carrying with an authority that made even seasoned soldiers fall into position without question. One hand braced against her stomach, the other gripping a blade she hadn't drawn in months but hadn't forgotten how to use. When the last of the attackers fled into the trees, she was breathing hard, alive with an adrenaline she hadn't felt since the courtyard battle, and every soldier on that road looked at her with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not doubt, but respect. Bram didn't run. He simply stood, sword lowered, waiting for judgment with the tired resignation of a man who'd made his choice long before that morning. "Take him to the palace," Niklaus said, voice flat with a betrayal too fresh to fully process yet. "He'll answer to the same council as Draven." They reached the palace gates by nightfall. Draven's remaining loyal guards, hearing of the failed ambush and Yara's testimony already spreading ahead of them, simply stood aside. Whatever fear had held the Regency together cracked completely the moment real proof arrived. They found Draven in the council hall, Isolde beside him, both already aware the tide had turned entirely against them. "You're supposed to be dead on that road," Draven said. "Your man made a poor investment," Niklaus said. "I got tired of hiding, especially once I realized there was never a real reason to." Isolde's eyes moved past her son, landing on Nina, on the unmistakable full curve of 9 months of pregnancy, and something in her composed, cruel face finally cracked. "That's not possible." "5," Nina said, stepping forward despite Niklaus's protective hand. "Not a plague, not a curse, a gift, according to Yara, that your seer knew about and buried before anyone could believe it. You didn't send me away to save this kingdom from illness. You sent me away because you were terrified of exactly what I'm carrying now." Aldrich, pale and cornered, finally broke, confessing everything to the full council within the hour. The years of fabricated barrenness, the invented plague, the coin paid by both Draven and Isolde to keep Nina discredited and controlled. Draven was charged with treason and led away without protest, his discipline finally, completely spent. Bram was stripped of rank and exiled, his betrayal a wound Niklaus knew would take far longer to heal than any physical scar. Isolde was confined to the eastern estate under permanent guard. As the guards led her out, she paused at the door, looking back once at Nina with something colder than hatred. "You think this is over," she said quietly. "A crown doesn't forget who tried to take it. Somewhere, someone will remember what I tried to do here. And one day, your children will learn exactly how thin the line is between being loved and being useful to a throne." She let the words sit like a blade left buried and was gone before anyone could answer her. Nina felt the chill of it settle briefly, then let it go, one hand resting over her stomach, over 5 hearts beating in their strange, unified rhythm. "Let her have her bitterness," she said quietly, to Niklaus, to herself. "It's the only kingdom she has left to rule." That evening, with the palace finally quiet under its rightful king, Nina stood on the balcony overlooking the same courtyard where she'd once knelt, fevered and humiliated. Niklaus wrapped his arms around her from behind, hands resting over the weight of 5 lives nearly ready to meet the world. "We did it," he murmured. "Almost," she said, laughing softly. 5 very important arrivals still pending. Epilogue. Nina gave birth on a clear autumn night, 5 healthy wolf pups born into a kingdom that would never again call their mother broken. Yara delivered them herself, murmuring in wonder as each heartbeat she'd once heard beating in strange unison finally drew its first separate breath. Niklaus wept, holding the first of them, a year of bracing for loss finally unclenching in his chest. Mirella declared herself permanently retired from doubting Nina ever again, though everyone in the room knew she'd be back the very next morning, sleeves rolled up, ready to teach 5 new lives everything she'd once taught their mother. Months later, watching Nina cross that same courtyard, 5 pups tumbling at her feet, and a kingdom finally hers to help rule, Niklaus understood what his grandfather's empty castle had truly given them. Not just shelter, but the space to become exactly who they were always meant to be. Far away in a quiet eastern estate, Isolde watched the sunset alone, already writing the first of many letters no one would ever answer. Bitterness with nowhere left to go, a queen who'd traded her crown for the cold comfort of being right about no one else. But in the palace, none of that mattered anymore. Only the sound of 5 small heartbeats, finally, safely, beating free.